Mary was accustomed to living in darkness. The youngest member of her family, she lived with her mother and older sister, Bella, in a house on the countryside. Being born blind, sounds were her primary means of interacting with the world around her. After 9 years, she could identify any voice she heard just once. Thus, she was terrified that night, as she was sure the voice she heard was not her mother's. Devil, possession, priest, these were words Mary had overheard in conversations between Bella and her boyfriend Randy, who visited their house every day. She was too young to understand their meanings, and no one wanted to scare her, so they kept her in the dark. Despite this, Mary knew they were talking about their mother, Haley, who had fallen ill a few weeks prior with a mysterious illness that baffled doctors. Stranger than her mother's illness was the question Bella repeatedly asked Mary. What happened that day in the old house? Bella's question referred to an old eerie house in their neighborhood, rumored to be haunted. None of the locals went near it. The house's last heir, trying to sell it, had paid Haley, who cleaned houses, a good sum to tidy it up. Mary didn't understand why her sister kept asking about the old house, but Bella had a crucial reason for her questions. Mary and her playful dog, Benji, were the only ones with their mother that day, the day her illness began. The only thing Mary remembered from that day was when her mother went to the basement of the mysterious house to clean. Haley stayed down there for a long time, and when Mary tried to talk to her, she got no response. But Mary also recalled something stranger. As soon as Haley emerged from the basement, Benji started barking uncontrollably. Benji only barked at strangers, and Mary was sure no one else was in the house except her and her mother. The barking continued for days, and they had to keep Benji in the yard, unlike usual. 2 days after returning from that house, Haley's behavior changed completely. It was Sunday. But unlike usual, when Haley was the first to get ready and take the kids to church, she had no desire to go. When they tried to bring her along, she screamed and broke the dishes. That evening, the local church priest visited Haley. Mary wasn't allowed to listen to the conversation between the priest, Haley, and Bella, but she noticed doctors and psychiatrists frequently visiting their home, trying treatments that never worked. Haley's condition worsened daily, scaring Mary even more. 2 weeks after Haley's illness began, Mary started waking up at night, terrified. She often sensed someone entering her room while she was asleep. Mary was sure it was her mother. She recognized the scent she loved so much, but now it scared her, because no matter how much she called out, Haley wouldn't respond, even though Mary was certain she was standing by her bed. Mary's fear grew, and one night, her sister asked her to lock the door before bed. Mary knew it was her mother trying to get into her room at night, but she promised Bella she wouldn't open the door for anyone except her. A few days later, Bella asked Mary to stay in her room and not come out, no matter what she heard. Bella's request made Mary cry, not just because she knew something terrible was happening in their house, but also because she hadn't seen her mother that day and could hear her screaming from the basement, a scream that sounded different and unfamiliar. That day, aside from Randy, 2 other people came to their house. Mary recognized one of them as Father Xavier, their town's preacher, but the other was a stranger named Father Rodrigo, who had come from another town. Mary didn't understand the strange phrases the priests were saying in the basement with her mother, but she was terrified and crying. She crawled under her bed, covered her ears with her hands to block out the sound of her mother's agonized screams, and eventually fell asleep. She woke up an hour later, feeling like she had heard Bella and Randy screaming. Emerging from under the bed, Mary found the house in an eerily silent, which prompted her to leave her room. She had only taken a few steps when she tripped on a slippery liquid and fell on something, a human body. It was Randy, lying on the floor. Mary called his name, but he didn't respond. As she touched him, she realized his clothes were wet. and there was an unpleasant smell she recognized from when she had cut her foot on glass weeks earlier. The smell of blood now filling the entire house. Frightened, Mary groped her way to Bella's room, calling for her sister as she entered, but Bella didn't respond either. The slippery liquid covered the floor, making it difficult for Mary to reach the bed. Bella lay in bed, but in an unusual position, half on the floor, her clothes also wet and reeking of the same unpleasant smell. Mary was about to cry out in fear when she noticed another presence in the room. Haley was sitting on the bed next to Bella's lifeless body, quietly crying and muttering to herself. Mary called her mother several times, but Haley didn't seem to notice, continuing to mutter to herself. Mary approached and placed her small hands on her mother's face, trying to get her attention. When suddenly a hand pulled her away, it was Bella who told her to be quiet. Speaking was difficult for Bella, but she had something important to say. "Don't let her find you. She's not Mom," Bella whispered into Mary's ear before pushing her towards the door, urging her to leave the room quickly. Mary didn't fully understand Bella's words, but knew her sister never lied to her. So with tears streaming down her face, she left the room. As soon as she entered the hallway, her mother's muttering stopped. Mary had to quietly navigate the long, narrow hallway towards the front door, but the sound of footsteps behind her grew louder with every step, the creaking wooden floorboards indicating someone was closing in on her. Realizing she wouldn't make it to the door in time, Mary ducked into the first open room she saw, unaware that it was the basement. Mary fell down the basement stairs and briefly lost consciousness. She was awakened by the sound of her mother coming down the stairs. Attempting to move, she discovered her left leg was broken and had to drag herself across the floor. The basement was filled with the unpleasant smell of blood, which Mary now recognized. Her hand brushed against a body lying motionless on the floor. The only people in the basement were the two priests Mary had heard earlier, and she knew the lifeless body before her had to be one of them. As she reached out to touch the priest's face, she felt a metal cross embedded in his eye. Screaming, she recoiled from the corpse. Her mother's approaching footsteps terrified her, but she also heard another sound, the faint prayers of Father Xavier, who seemed to be injured and struggling to continue. Mary followed his voice, but soon she heard the sickening sound of bones breaking, and Father Xavier's prayers stopped forever. An oppressive silence followed. Mary didn't need to see. She could feel her mother's gaze on her. Desperately, she dragged herself across the floor, searching for a way to escape, when suddenly she felt her mother's cold hand grip her ankle. She screamed and begged her mother to let her go. Only seconds later, she felt the cold, sharp edge of a knife against her throat, followed by a gush of blood. Not her own, but her mother's. Bella had arrived in the basement and killed their mother with gardening shears. Mary was saved, but her nightmares never ended. Nightmares of her possessed mother silently watching her from the darkness.